For more than 60 years, Sir Cliff Richard carried a silence about one man who unknowingly shaped the course of his destiny, Paul McCartney. They were not enemies, they never exchanged cruel words, yet something unspoken lived between them, a quiet ache, born from the moment Britain crowned a new favorite son. In the late 1950s, Cliff had been the star, the first to make British rock and roll sound like its own heartbeat. Girls fainted, cameras flashed, parents whispered. He was the sound of a nation breaking free from the gray fog of post-war life. Then came the Beatles, 4 boys from Liverpool who turned the world upside down, and in that sudden rush of sound and fame, the cheers that once filled arenas for Cliff drifted somewhere else, to Paul. The headlines changed, the photos on magazine covers changed, even the tone of the crowds felt different, and for the first time in his life, Cliff Richard felt forgotten. He smiled for the cameras, congratulated them, even called them good lads. But behind that composure lived a truth he never dared to admit, a truth he's finally whispering now, at 84, because what he truly felt for Paul McCartney wasn't rivalry. It was something far more fragile, far more human, a mirror reflecting the rise, the loss, and the peace every artist must one day face. In the late 1950s, long before Beatlemania, before screaming the stadiums and flashing cameras became the norm, there was Cliff Richard. He wasn't just another young man with a microphone. He was Britain's first true rock star. The moment he stepped onto the stage in his black suit, narrow tie, and a slicked back hair, something shifted in the air. His grin was confident, his movements sharp but effortless. And when he sang "Move It," the crowd lost its composure. For the first time, British teenagers had a sound that belonged entirely to them. His songs like "Living Doll" and "Move It" didn't just top charts, they defined an era. He was no longer copying America's Elvis Presley. He was creating something British, something new. Every chord, every cheer was proof that the island had finally found its own voice. For a few golden years, Cliff Richard reigned supreme. Every record went straight to number 1. Every appearance caused chaos, and his smile alone could make headlines. The newspapers called him our Elvis. He performed for royalty, packed arenas, and gave young Britain its first taste of pop rebellion, polite yet thrilling. Parents worried, teenagers adored him, and even the critics couldn't deny his charm. Cliff wasn't dangerous, not in the way later rock stars would be, but he had rhythm, magnetism, and something that felt like freedom. Then came 1963, and everything, the cheers, the headlines, the rhythm of his world, began to change. The Beatles exploded onto the scene, raw and witty, their energy unstoppable. Almost overnight, teenage girls who once waited for hours outside Cliff's dressing room were now screaming for Paul McCartney. The magazines that once devoted every page to Cliff now filled their covers with the 4 faces from Liverpool. In public, Cliff stayed gracious. He congratulated them, smiled in interviews, and even referred to them as the new generation. But privately, something deeper stirred. Not anger, but confusion. He had opened the doors they now walked through. The boys who replaced him were the ones who once studied his every move on stage, imitating the man they would one day eclipse. And as the applause slowly faded, Cliff Richard faced the most painful truth every pioneer must confront. He had built the very world that no longer needed him. As the world turned its gaze toward Liverpool, Cliff Richard found himself standing in the quiet shadow of his own success. The cheers that had once followed him everywhere were now softer, almost nostalgic. But even in that silence, he refused to let bitterness take root. He kept performing, smiling for the cameras, and releasing songs that still spoke to those who had grown up with him. And yet, deep inside, there lingered an ache, a question that every artist eventually faces. What happens when the world moves on from you? Then, in the mid-1960s, fate arranged a meeting that would change everything. It happened backstage at a BBC event, a night filled with energy, laughter, and history in the making. Cliff was waiting in one studio, preparing to perform. From the next room came the unmistakable sound of the crowd chanting, "The Beatles! The Beatles!" He could hear their voices through the walls, and for a brief moment he wondered if that sound would ever belong to him again. Then the door opened. Paul McCartney walked in, charming, playful, confident in that effortless way youth always seems to be. He greeted Cliff with warmth, as if meeting an old friend rather than a rival. "Cliff," Paul said with a smile, "you started all this?" Those simple words carried a weight far greater than they seemed. For a moment, the past and the future of British music stood face to face, one man who had built the stage and another who was now lighting it up. Cliff congratulated the Beatles on their success. Paul thanked him for the inspiration. It was sincere. The Beatles had grown up watching him on Oh Boy, copying his moves, learning how to handle fame from the man who'd done it first. But even as he accepted the compliment, Cliff felt a quiet sting. He realized, standing there, that he had become part of someone else's origin story, a chapter in the rise of a new legend. Still, he smiled. He wouldn't let pride or regret ruin that moment. Over the years, their paths crossed again. At award shows, charity events, and royal galas. Each time, Paul radiated charm and playfulness, while Cliff carried himself with the calm of a man who had learned discipline and grace. They didn't need to speak much. There was an unspoken understanding. Two men who had lived through the same fire of fame, each bearing the scars in his own quiet way. Cliff once said in an interview that watching Paul perform was both a joy and a lesson. Paul made everything look so easy. The melodies, the humor, the connection with the crowd. Cliff's success had come from discipline and polish. Paul's from instinct and risk. It was admiration, tinged with longing, because Paul embodied the freedom Cliff had never allowed himself. By the early 1970s, the paths of Cliff Richard and Paul McCartney had completely diverged. Paul was redefining pop music with wings, writing new anthems, filling stadiums across the continents. Meanwhile, Cliff found himself searching, not for fame, but for something far quieter. He had everything the world promised: wealth, recognition, endless applause. But when the lights faded and the crowds went home, what remained was emptiness. He began to wonder what success was really worth if it couldn't silence the loneliness that followed him everywhere. It was during those years of quiet questioning that faith entered his life, not as a headline or a publicity stunt, but as salvation. Cliff turned toward Christianity, a decision that startled the music world. The man once called Britain's Elvis now spoke openly about grace, discipline, and the purpose of life beyond applause. He withdrew from the constant nightlife, walked away from the parties and fame chasing that had defined the pop scene. Instead, he began recording gospel-inspired albums, music that soothed his spirit even if it confused his fans. Critics called it career suicide, but Cliff didn't care anymore. He wasn't chasing charts. He was chasing peace. While Paul continued to create, experiment, and push musical boundaries, Cliff found himself living a life of order and routine. Paul thrived in chaos, a creative storm that turned emotions into melodies. Cliff found comfort in the structure, prayer, reflection, and calm. They were like two sides of the same coin. Paul, the eternal innovator, following his heart wherever it led. Cliff, the grounded believer, finding a strength in stillness. But even as he devoted himself to faith, Cliff could never quite escape Paul's shadow. Everywhere he turned, Paul's music played. On the radio, in shops, in documentaries that celebrated the genius of the Beatles. The same media that once called Cliff our national treasure now referred to him as a relic of the pre-Beatles era. It hurt more than he ever admitted. He told friends that faith had cured him of jealousy. And maybe it had, most days. But when Paul's songs reached the top again, when crowds sang Hey Jude with tears in their eyes, something inside Cliff stirred. It wasn't envy exactly, it was reflection. A quiet wondering if, in his pursuit of purity, he had sacrificed a part of his artistic fire, if perhaps in saving his soul he had lost a piece of his wild heart. Still, he told himself that peace was better than applause, that meaning was worth more than fame, and yet, sometimes at night, when the world went still, he would think of Paul and wonder what it might have been like to have lived without restraint. By the mid-1980s, the chaos of the Beatle years had finally faded into memory. John Lennon was gone. George Harrison had stepped away from the spotlight, and Paul McCartney carried a legacy heavier than any gold record could ever measure. Cliff Richard watched from afar, not as a rival now, but as a man who understood the quiet price of survival. He had outlived the noise, the gossip, the dizzying highs of fame. The headlines no longer called him a teen idol. They called him a survivor. His music had matured, a blend of pop precision and gospel serenity. His audience, once wild teenagers, had grown up with him, bringing their children to his concerts. He no longer needed to prove anything, and yet every time Paul released something new, the comparisons returned. The press couldn't resist Britain's first pop star versus the man who replaced him. It wasn't meant as cruelty. It was nostalgia, the echo of an old story Britain never forgot. Then, one night, fate brought them together again. It was a private charity concert, small, intimate, filled with artists who had once ruled the airwaves. Cliff didn't expect much, just another performance, another polite evening. But when he saw Paul walk into the room, something inside him shifted. Paul looked older, gentler. The mischievous spark is still there, but softened by time. When their eyes met, there was no trace of rivalry, only recognition. Later that evening, backstage, they spoke quietly. No cameras, no reporters, no scripts. Just two men who had once defined an era, now standing side by side, humbled by time. Paul clasped Cliff's hand and said, almost in a whisper, "You started all this." For a moment, Cliff couldn't speak. Those 4 words carried 60 years of unspoken weight. Acknowledgement, respect, closure. In that instant, the ache that had haunted him since 1963 finally eased. He realized he had never needed trophies or headlines. What he had longed for all along was understanding, the simple recognition from the man the world had chosen after him. That night, something in Cliff's heart quieted. The long shadow of the past lifted. He didn't just see Paul as the man who took his crown. He saw him as the one who carried the torch forward. In the years that followed, Cliff began to speak of Paul differently. There was no trace of resentment anymore, only warmth. He called Paul a craftsman, a true artist, and even began performing Beatles songs at his shows, not in imitation, but in tribute. Each time he sang them, he could feel something healing, the rivalry dissolving into respect, the past folding into peace. Decades passed. The frenzy of youth faded into nostalgia, and both Cliff Richard and Paul McCartney became living testaments to endurance, men who had not just survived fame, but outgrown it. When Cliff finally decided to speak openly about Paul, it wasn't in a tell-all interview or some carefully planned documentary. It happened softly, almost accidentally, during a conversation about gratitude. He was asked, "Which artist do you admire most?" Cliff paused for a long moment, smiled gently, and said one word, "Paul." The room went still. Then he added, "Because he kept the world singing." It was a simple line, but it carried the weight of 6 decades. He explained that there was a time when he felt overshadowed, even forgotten, after the Beatles rose to fame. But age and reflection had given him perspective. "Paul didn't take anything from me," he said softly. "He carried it forward. Without the Beatles, British music might have stopped with me. Instead, it became eternal." Those words ended decades of speculation and rewrote the narrative the press had built. What the world had called rivalry was really reverence, and what had once been envy was now peace. He even admitted that he had long envied Paul's creative fearlessness. "Paul wrote what he felt," Cliff said. "I sang what people needed. There's a difference, and both matter." It was the closest he ever came to confession, not of bitterness, but of understanding. In later interviews, Cliff spoke about how Paul reminded him of the beauty in imperfection, that sometimes art wasn't meant to be polished, it was meant to breathe. While Cliff spent his life perfecting every note, Paul spent his breaking the rules. And somehow both had found their truth. "Paul's courage," Cliff said, "taught me to see my own journey differently, to measure legacy not by applause but by meaning." He realized that longevity isn't about how long your name is remembered, it's about whether your songs still mean something to someone. And as the years passed, that became enough. The man who once feared being replaced began to see the beauty in simply being remembered at all. Every generation needed its own voice, and that was the natural rhythm of life. When asked once if he had ever told Paul all of this, Cliff just smiled and said, "I think he knows. We've both outlived the noise. What's left is friendship." And in that quiet acceptance, the story of two giants finally found its ending. Not in rivalry, but in grace. Not in fame, but in understanding. At 84, Cliff Richard looks back not with regret, but with gratitude. He sees his journey as the bridge between what was and what came next. Paul carried that bridge further, proving that pop could evolve without losing its heart. They were never rivals in spirit, only travelers on the same road. One built it, the other paved it with song. And when Cliff finally spoke his truth, it wasn't about jealousy, it was about love for the music, for the memories, for the man who showed him that legacy isn't something you protect, it's something you pass on.